Peter Laarman from Los Angeles, City of Angels, where chastity and fidelity are practiced all the time.
And this is Father Jim Martin from America Magazine in New York, where I am, in fact, practicing celibacy and chastity all the time.
Indeed you are. And let's begin with that distinction, Jim. And I'm going to call you Jim because you granted me permission, not because
Absolutely.
I'm in any way disrespectful.
Not at all.
So if you would, just let's tell our esteemed viewers what this important difference is, because I think the terms are confused a great bit.
Yeah, in essence, chastity is really something in the Catholic tradition that everybody is called to. So it's the right use of your sexuality. And so we're all called to chastity. Married couples are called to practice chastity within their marriage, which doesn't mean they don't have sex. It just means it's the correct and proper and healthy use of their sexuality. As for religious orders, chastity is a vow that people take in order to commit themselves totally to loving God and loving other people, and it means refraining from having sex or being in an exclusive relationship. Celibacy technically is the restriction against marriage that exists for members of the clergy. So celibacy and chastity are a little different in terms of Catholic terminology. In essence, though, they're lived out the same way, which is basically a religious commitment that includes not having an exclusive relationship, but making yourself open and available to loving many people very deeply. So chastity is what someone in a religious community vows, and celibacy is what someone who is an ordained priest promises. And actually, I have a vow of chastity as a Jesuit, a member of a religious order, but I also make a promise of celibacy as a priest. So that's kind of the distinction. But, for all practical purposes, they're lived out the same way.
I got you. Now, this promise that you make regarding celibacy, you make for a very specific spiritual reason. And again, for exposition purposes, would you say what that is?
Well, sure. It's basically, now the history of celibacy is a little complex. Initially, obviously the first priests were not celibate; they were married. I mean, we know that Saint Peter, that Jesus goes and visits his mother-in-law, so we know that Peter, the first pope, traditionally was married. But in the history of the church, what happened was two things happened at the same time. There was a difficulty in transferring property from the priests to the priests' children, right? So it was sort of for a practical reason. But also, the idea was that the chaste way of life, the celibate way of life was, which is not thought of this any longer, was a kind of higher calling, was sort of more dedicated. These days, if you asked a priest or someone in a religious order why they're vowing chastity, it's really to love other people freely without being in an exclusive relationship, and to sort of commit yourself totally to God. Now, that doesn't mean that people in other religious denominations can't love freely and can't love other people deeply, but this is the way that works for Catholics in religious orders and for priests. So that's kind of the spiritual reason. Celibacy and chastity are really meant to help you love and be a loving person.
Right, and we'll loop back in this direction in a little bit. I was intrigued this weekend. I heard you interviewed by Scott Simon on Weekend Edition, and you said something that stuck for me. You said that there are a number, and of course there are a number, of persons in the priesthood who are celibate and gay, and the reason that struck me is that I'm acquainted with some priests in New York and also here who are non-celibate. They're in loving, committed relationships. And what at least some of them have said to me is they find that to be an enhancement of their capacity to do ministry, in that their sexual nature is sufficiently satisfied, that they are not tempted into inappropriate relationships with people to whom they minister. And I simply raise that, and again, we're going to make a huge distinction here, which we must make, between homosexual behavior, pedophilia. We have to be clear about these things. But I think that what they say has some merit in a way. They're simply trying to be responsible and to avoid the occasion for sinning.
Well, I'd have to disagree with that. First of all, I think you're right that we need to make the distinction between homosexuality and pedophilia, but I think that your question presumes that if a person is celibate, they're somehow tempted to become a pedophile, which I wouldn't agree with. So I think that
not a pedophile, Jim, but they could be tempted to have a a healthy relationship with a person of the same gender.
well, but I mean, I think a person who's married would have that same temptation as well. I mean, I don't think that being in a married relationship or an exclusive relationship
Really?
means you're being tempted. So
Really,
yeah,
you don't think it's a help?
well, yeah, I think so, but I don't think it precludes it. I think that I have to say I know that there are Catholic priests who don't keep their vows, just like there are married people who don't keep their vows. Right? I don't think that argues against celibacy any more than it argues against marriage. I think that people, it's not for everybody. Frankly, I think if you find that you can't live celibately or you can't live chastely, then I think it's time to start thinking of leaving the priesthood or leaving a religious life. The same way that if you couldn't live your married vows, it would be time to sort of think about how serious you are in terms of your commitment. I think the problem I have with that, I mean, I've heard that before. That's called the third way in Catholic circles.
Okay.
One of the biggest problems I have with that, frankly, is that I think that the last thing the church needs right now is people who are promising one thing and not keeping their promise. So I understand that the sort of human desire, certainly for a relationship, and I'm not denigrating that. I'm not denigrating sexuality, but I think the difficulty is with someone who's made a public commitment for one thing and is doing something else on the sly, really, which I think is really problematic for people's sense of priestly integrity. So that's the main problem I have with that.
I understand. We'll come back to the
Sure.
matter of integrity, I'm sure, a little bit later on. I heard you say in discussing the history that for a time celibacy was considered to be a higher calling, and I know that in reading church history, while celibacy was reaffirmed, or at least affirmed importantly in the reign of Leo the Great, there are lots of occasions in the later times, in the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries, when it was found, according to records, that more than half the priests in France and Germany were, in fact, still married. Mm-hmm. So, it was sort of a negotiated thing.
Right.
Isn't it possible that, and again, I don't denigrate celibacy as a noble calling, but isn't it possible that it is a higher calling, that it's a special charism or special gift for some persons and not for others? It's always been my view that might actually be the case.
No, I think that's a great question. I think I would refine that a little bit. I wouldn't say I'd say that I agree with you that it's different. It's I think, and I'm glad you brought this question up, because I think one of the great problems in terms of people understanding celibacy is that there still is this popular conception out there, even though since at least the Second Vatican Council this hasn't been the case, that somehow celibacy or chastity is better than. When I was a little boy in Sunday school, I remember they had a little drawings that we were supposed to color in, and it was states of life, right?
Yep,
they had a picture of a man and a woman married, and it said good.
Yeah.
And on the other side of the page, they had a priest and a nun, and it said better.
Yeah.
And I think that, certainly in the past, you're absolutely right. In the past, that was seen as better. And there's a whole lot of theological reasons for that, what I would say error, which was that, the sort of Pauline distinction between the flesh and the spirit. The spirit is over the flesh, and some of the historical problems that the church has had with human sexuality. But certainly since at least the 1960s, the idea that everyone's vocation, married, lay, single, vowed, is equally as holy is really important. So I would say it's different. It's not higher. But you're right. Some people are called to it and some people are not. I mean, one of the things I really want to get across is it's not for everybody. I mean, clearly, it's not for the huge majority of people. But it is for some people. And, you look at people like Mother Teresa, Francis of Assisi, John the 23rd. I mean,
right.
People who are living celibate lives and also, living very loving lives. So I think that you're right. The distinction between higher and different, I think, is an important one.
I like the not for everybody thing, but at a very pragmatic level, it needs to be for a fair number of people something that is doable and sustainable under current church law and practice. In that the Catholic community worldwide is growing, and there's an acute shortage of Eucharistic priests.
Oh, I totally agree. I mean, the question is, I heard a theology professor put it this way once: is the Catholic Church more interested in the Eucharist or in celibacy? Because of this great priest shortage. And I agree. I think if now the Church is actually making some strides towards that with this recent overture to the Anglicans, which I think is very interesting.
We'll talk about that.
Yeah, we will talk about that. But it's interesting that what is seen as kind of a move to incorporate more of a conservative group into the Church. These Anglicans that would come over would certainly be more conservative. Interestingly, it may open the door for a diminution of the requirement on priestly celibacy, because you're obviously bringing in married priests. I think that there's so many things that need to be sort of separated out. So, for example, and as we're talking in the wake of the sex abuse crisis, we have pedophilia, ephebophilia, homosexuality, celibacy, chastity, a married clergy, clerical culture. All those things are different.
Right.
So I think, yeah, you're right. Right now, the Catholic Church is, limiting, the number of people that can be priests because of the celibacy rule. But, and I think this is the important point, and why I'm glad we're able to have more time, that doesn't mean that celibacy would not still be right for some priests, nor does it mean that chastity would not still be right for people in religious orders. So I think you're right. I think that the notion of different vocations and different ways of loving is really an important one to get across.
Right. And would it be the case that people would think of that as the thin edge of the wedge?
Well, yeah.
At least some people who are conservative about this, because I was stunned, actually, at the overture to the Anglicans. I understood the politics of it, but I thought, oh my, this does have implications, and a lot of people will note those implications very quickly.
It does, and I think, if you have these Anglican groups being recognized as fully Catholic, that means, therefore, that, Roman Catholics can worship in their parishes, and they can feel free to sort of move in and out of their parishes. If that's the case, then does that mean that Roman Catholics in the West are going to be more comfortable with married priests? Now, in some of the Eastern rites in the Catholic Church, there are already married priests in some rites, particularly in Eastern Europe, but not in the West. And so does that mean in, for example, England and the United States, Catholics are going to become more comfortable seeing married priests? And I think the answer is yes. And that does have an implication for the future of the Church, I think. And, as we were saying, I think it is the thin edge of the wedge. But I think that a married clergy is something that seems to have been, part of the calculations for this opening. So I'm not sure what's behind it theologically, but it's certainly a reality that that's going to happen.
Well, and the Church is aware of its own history, so it understands that this is a house of many mansions and lots of. I mean, the difference between a discipline or a rule,
right,
ecclesial rule, and a doctrine is a significant difference. I think that many people assume that celibacy is an established doctrine of the Church. If that were the case, it couldn't be changed.
Right.
An ecclesial rule can be changed. I mean,
right,
never drastically, but it's conceivable.
Yeah, the difference is, though, that the Vatican came out in response to just those questions and said that we won't be changing things.
Yeah, I heard that.
So, but I think that it's inevitable. There's a recent article in the New Yorker about the Anglican communion, and they talk about the increase in women priests. And funny enough, they talk about that PBS show, The Vicar of Dibley. I don't know if you've seen that.
Saw it. Yep.
It's you have seen it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so it's about an Anglican vicar who's a woman, and they said that it was one of the most popular shows in the UK, and actually may have helped people get comfortable with this idea of women priests. But more importantly, that the more people see women priests, the more they just think it's natural, and it's not about being a man or a woman; it's being about a minister, being a minister. So I think this notion that as people get more comfortable, the sensus fidelium, which is the sort of sense of the faithful, changes, really does help to change the Church.
I know that's the case, and yet I've talked to many women, including many women religious, about this, and people involved in the Women's Church Convergence, which is an amazing network of people, feminists in the Catholic tradition, and it is universally the case that they say the Church will accept married men before it will accept women in the Eucharistic role, and I hope that's not the case, because I could see a whole new range of unhappiness and real bitterness if that were the case. In that, women are the backbone of the Church, the Catholic Church, but every church that I know, and their gifts for ministry are apparent. And the Protestant denominations had to struggle through this, but they did. Well, first, do you agree, Jim? Do you agree, Jim? Most of them have. Do you agree that the likelihood of married males coming in before women are admitted is the case?
Yes, I mean, I think because now the Vatican is still saying no on both counts, but by the same token, this overture to the Anglicans means that there are going to be more married Catholic male priests. So I guess the answer to the question is not even a theoretical one. It's a factual one. It's that it's happening right now. You're seeing more of an exodus from, at least early indications, an exodus from the Anglican communion on the conservative side. Ironically, because those very priests are upset about women priests and women bishops,
precisely,
the church, and ironically, perhaps, de facto changing the makeup of the clergy in the Catholic Church.
Yes, one that occurred to me. It does strengthen a point of view in regard to women's ordination. I mean, I think the issue, and I was pleased, frankly, by Nick Christoph's column in the Times over the weekend about a church Mary could be proud of. He acknowledged that among God's people, right, understanding that all are called to ministry in a certain sense, among God's people, these women are so strong and so resourceful and so faithful, really.
Well, and I'll tease something out a little bit, maybe challenge you a bit, if I may. Interestingly, the second half of that article was all about the nuns.
That's right.
I think one of the things I think I really want to stress in what I'm saying is that this comes out of their lived experience of love and chastity, and
You're
so
right.
you can't separate. For people who haven't read it, and I recommend that the article is terrific. Nicholas Christoph, who works a great deal in sub-Saharan Africa, where actually I worked with a lot of nuns a couple of years ago, talks about, in a sense, not forgetting the amazing work the church does with Catholic relief services and places like that, and especially the nuns, who he calls, possibly the coolest people on the planet. And, so here are women who are doing this great service to the people of God, for the world, particularly for the poor, and they're doing it, as chaste women, as people who are sort of loving, chaste apostles. So I think, they're perhaps the greatest example, and very hidden from people. No one's talking about the nuns, except when they're getting investigated by the Vatican these days. Really hidden lives of holiness. And I guess, the thing is, when people talk about, the cold and the bitter celibate, or the screwed up celibacy in the church, I think they're overlooking, a great deal of the good that gets done by people like the women that Nicholas Christoph were talking about.
Right. It's a wonderful article.
That's my little pitch for nuns.
Yeah. And if people haven't seen this, it was on the 18th of April in the upper right-hand corner. Christoph also says that he does a little history in this, and I think his history is good. He says, going back to the early church, yet over the ensuing centuries, the church reverted to strong patriarchal attitudes while also becoming increasingly uncomfortable with sexuality. The problem arises, and again, I say this with all respect, Jim, it's a little patronizing with regard to the women religious, these strong women who are saving the world in many ways. It's a little patronizing to say, you have these great strengths and gifts, and they grow out of your lived chastity and your undivided love, which is true, But you stay at your station, you stay at your level. You are not approved for the real jobs in the church. The man's job, the serving of Christ's body.
Mm-hmm. No, I think certainly, even presenting the question of women's ordination, I think that it's clear that women need to be in leadership roles in the church.
Mm-hmm.
Whether or not that means ordination or not, I don't think that's going to happen in our lifetime. But I do think that these women, who are the backbone of the church and who are the leaders in the church, should be given more roles of leadership. I mean, I believe that with my whole heart. I also think that were women involved in more leadership roles and were involved more in the discussion of the church, the sex abuse crisis would have been much different. I think there's a certain sensibility and experience that they bring as women, and I also say the same with married men, married women, and parents. They also should be given voices in the church, and I think that one of the great failures of the church has been since the Second Vatican Council not to have formal structures in which people like that can exercise real roles of leadership, not simply consultative, but actual leadership in the church. I think, to tease it out a little bit more, the problem is that the leadership roles are all held by ordained males. There was an interesting idea floated a few years ago about making women cardinals, even though they might not be ordained, right? Because the cardinal is kind of an honorific.
Right.
That was scotched. And yet,
that would
by the same token,
that would have been very cool, by the way.
Well, by the same token, let me tell you. I mean, you talk to a lot of. I mean, I have hundreds and hundreds of, well, maybe not hundreds. I'd say scores of friends who are sisters, and frankly, a lot of them, some of them would want to be ordained. Most of them would want to be have more of a voice in the church. But frankly, a lot of them don't want to be in the sort of clerical structure as it is today.
I got you.
A lot of sisters say to me, if it's going to continue the way it is today, and I think we see some of the ill effects of it in terms of the sex abuse crisis, the sort of closed clerical culture and the culture that fosters power and secrecy. Now, that's not to say that all priests are like that, or all bishops are like that, or that clerical culture, begins and ends with that. But that is certainly a part of it. That's one of the negative parts of it. As in any culture, there are positives and negatives. But many sisters say that I don't want to be a part of that, and they actually prefer to be working, with the poor on the front lines, as do a lot of priests and brothers, frankly. I mean, right. The Vatican is a pretty small place, and most of the priests, in the world are not in the Vatican, and they're in the parishes, and they really don't want any part of that. So I think there's another distinction to be made between women's ordination, leadership roles, clerical culture, and what women are doing today.
I'm with you completely, and many of the women religious with whom I'm friends say the same thing. They don't particularly want to be doing those jobs, but the idea that they're close to them is still offensive. I remember once talking to Elizabeth Gisela Fiorenza, the great theologian,
she's fantastic.
And she said to some of us, she said, "Well, Phil," she still has the accent, Phil, they asked me, actually, they said to me once, you might, if we were to ordain a priest, it would be you. And she said, but I would like to start a bishop. I appreciate that.
I guess the thing is, I feel that, the contribution of women religious in this country has been, I think, almost completely overlooked by the secular media. Very interesting. We had a hospital in New York City, St. Vincent's. Are you familiar with that hospital?
I used to live around the corner from St. Vincent's.
There you go.
This whole thing is killing me. It's killing me.
It is. Well, St. Vincent's was started by the Sisters of Charity. And one of the reasons it's closing, I mean, there are many reasons it's closing, but one of the reasons it's closing because of financial problems is that these sisters who founded the first hospital for the poor in the city, St. Vincent's, which for non-New Yorkers is downtown, and served a lot of AIDS patients, served people during 9/11. The sisters started the hospital, on their own with nothing, and were taking no salaries. And what happened was, over the the course of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, as vocations started to drop, the hospital had to replace sisters who were doing it for free with people who, needed a salary, obviously. I mean, it's just, important to have a fair wage. And so the lack of vocations in the sisters' orders means that a lot of these hospitals close. And I think the sad thing for me is that, when St. Vincent's closed, there were all these obituaries of it in the New York Times and all these different papers, and people were lamenting it, but they never really thought, why is this happening? It's because of the wonderful contribution of nuns that's no longer there.
That's right. That's exactly it.
So in a sense, I could also argue that, frankly, to argue from a theological point of view, the quote-unquote contribution, of the nuns is maybe more important than the contribution of bishops and cardinals. Who would Jesus sort of point to in terms of who's really doing the Christian work? Is it the bishops and cardinals who are doing valuable things, or is it the nuns in the Sudan and the nuns at St. Vincent's? I mean, that's an open question. So there's what society thinks of as power, and I think there's also what which I agree with. I agree with you that they need to be led into roles of authority, but then there's also the sort of paradoxical power that Christ talks about, and it's here where I think where the sisters are really more, in a sense, powerful.
Yeah, it's the case, and maybe some of that power comes from working at the margins. I mean, here in Los Angeles, we're about to get a new archbishop who will become a cardinal,
right.
Archbishop Gomez, and we know that he's going to be pretty fabulous, and he'll step into the shoes of Cardinal Mahoney on immigration and workplace issues, which are important to everyone. But it's also very clear from his training and his public statements that he's going to be a ruthless enforcer of the Pope's views on anything related to sexuality and gender.
Yeah, I don't know if I use the word ruthless though.
Well,
let's say
my word. It certainly looks that way. Yeah. The interview you gave to the Los Angeles Times suggested that. So the difficulty that causes is, of course, everybody becomes anxious around this because, I mean, he does have institutional power. There's 5 million people in this archdiocese. And, anything that is related to issues, arenas and fora that he can control, it's a problem for people who are, shall we say, more in keeping with the spirit of the aggiornamento.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think I disagree with that. I think you got to give the guy a chance. I mean, he's not even there yet.
We'll give him a chance. It's Los Angeles. He'll get 5 minutes.
Well, I think, yeah. I mean, I think in the public eye he'll get 5 minutes, but I do think that first of all, give the guy the benefit of the doubt. I would say first of all, he was pretty popular in San Antonio. I know priests. I just met priests this past week. I was at a priest conference, and they said he's very open. He listens. He's very pastoral. So I think on the one hand, he's going to be quite open in terms of the response to immigrants, and frankly, the idea that we have a Latino archbishop, I think, is a huge step forward for the church, and we'll have a Latino cardinal in the United States. And we'll wait to see how he deals with some of the other issues in Los Angeles, because I think a see, an archbishopric of that size really changes a person. Moving from San Antonio to Los Angeles means that you're ministering to a different group of people, which might require a different set of strategies. So he might surprise you.
I want to be surprised, and I will give him the benefit of the doubt, as will many others who recognize that the Roman Catholic community in our part of the country and everywhere in the country is a force for good and a force for renewal. We do get that. Jim, I want to switch it up a little bit. In our private conversations before we started recording this, I touched on issues that are they're not conversation killers, but they can be if they're used inappropriately, and I don't want to use them inappropriately. But speaking of integrity in ministry and transparency. Now, here I am. I'm not serving a parish right now, but I did serve a parish in New York, a congregation in Greenwich Village, and I was called to that pulpit as an openly gay man,
Mm-hmm.
and all the gay people in the congregation knew because I told them I was single, but I told them it's part of my understanding of ministry, certainly drilled into me in my preparation for ministry, that I will have zero contact of a romantic or sexual nature with anybody in this congregation, right?
This
And
is
I
you.
remember,
I'm sorry. This is you saying this to your congregation. Is that right?
yes, that's right.
Yeah. And this is this is a UCC congregation.
United Church of Christ and American Baptist,
Uh-huh.
and the other aspect of this is when we had an opening for an associate minister. I was the senior minister for an associate minister. There were a number of candidates who were gay males who were interested in this, and in a kind but I think appropriate way, the church and I said, we're not going to do that, not because we were scared of having more than one gay person in ministry. In fact, the person who was then brought into that position was a lesbian, an open lesbian, but because we don't want even the appearance of evil. Do you see what I mean? Even the appearance that the person, one of the people who was candidate, was very young, very attractive, right out of Harvard Divinity School, and I had a conversation with the leaders of the church council, and I said, I won't mention his name, but I said, people are going to think the wrong thing. They're going to think the wrong thing, even though nothing would happen between us.
Well, ironically,
so all of this is about trying to create a lot of transparency,
right?
And then also trying to, especially for the younger people in the church, trying to model the fact that these things are difficult and it's better to talk about them and not talk about them. It's better to acknowledge that we have sexual natures than to not acknowledge that we have sexual natures, all that kind of stuff. And again, I'm being clumsy in the way I'm putting this, but
no, that's
I want to get to that issue of modeling, because in one traditional view of the priesthood, you're not modeling a normal human life. You're modeling something that's extraordinary, the love of Christ for the church. And I think and I'm a low church person, and I'm in the low church segment of the Protestant tradition. We think of modeling as something different, a little bit different. We think of modeling as, modeling healthy, ethical human interaction in a complex world, so that people can see that you're yes, you are called by God in a particular way, but you're also a normal human being.
Yeah, but that's presuming that a celibate person can't be healthy, ethical, or normal. Which I would disagree with.
It sounds like I'm saying that. I'm not actually saying that.
I'm saying
it's normal. I think it's normal I think it's normal in a way that's so extraordinary in this culture as to appear abnormal.
No, I don't know about that at all. You think of one of the things that I think that's missing in this conversation is this idea that celibate priests are the only ones that are celibate. Think of all the people who are living singly, okay? Or who are widows or widowers, or who are confirmed bachelors or unmarried. There are plenty of people that live celibate lifestyles, some involuntarily and some voluntarily, and no one says they're abnormal or they're unhealthy or they're unethical or they're just strange. I take your point. I think that once again, I would say that it's not setting the priest up as the avatar or the sister or the brother, because clearly, when we're celebrating the sacrament of marriage, we're blessing unions and sexual unions. So I don't think I think in the past maybe there would have been the sense of the priest as better or the sister as better. I just think it's modeling a different way to love. And ironically, I think one of the things that you pointed to in your own experience was the value of celibacy. You were saying in a sort of oblique way that you were telling your congregation, I will refrain from sexual relations with this person, and in a sense it's a kind of celibacy in order that I can be more available to you and in order that I can be sort of more wholehearted with you. For me, I don't set myself up as anything better or higher or something like that. It's just a different way of loving. And I think one of the great misconceptions is that celibate priests and sisters think that celibacy is better or should be for everybody. And, you look at the examples of those nuns in Nicholas Kristof's piece, and I can't imagine that people aren't drawn to them. I can't imagine that the people with whom they work don't love them, or think that they're somehow abnormal or wrong or unethical. So I really do think that it's when you meet healthy, loving, celibate people, a lot of those, I would say, misconceptions about the way that we supposedly set ourselves up are really destroyed. I would throw out to you that, it's debatable, but at least there is an argument, and I believe it, that Jesus was celibate.
Yeah.
Jesus was celibate. It seems he was celibate. There's a lot of, sort of proof of that. For example, the New Testament talks a lot about his brothers and sisters, but it doesn't talk about, a wife, which is odd. It's very strange that would have been left out. It seems that he was celibate for some sort of religious reason, out of a sort of commitment, or even a sign, a sort of sign value of his love for God. And so, a priest and a nun that do that, I think, are making the same sort of commitment and also trying to be the same sort of sign value. And especially, I would actually like to ask you a question. I think that one question I would have would be, don't you think that the chaste person in a culture that is hypersexualized says not that sex is bad, but that there are other ways to love, which is actually, I think, a healthy message? Would you not say that that's a healthy message to impart to people from a very sort of small minority of priests and sisters?
Right.
Wouldn't you say that that's an
I completely agree with you, Jeb. I actually think that would be a sign of appropriate and healthy resistance to the sex-saturated culture. Yes, and I also want to back off a little bit. I didn't mean really to say that the sexually engaged person is the only model.
Yeah.
The difficulty is really theory and practice of celibacy. I think from the point of view of people in the pews, what's confusing about this is that, first of all, for many, and it's hard to put this particular ding back in the bell, but pardon the.
I'm not sure what that expression means.
But I heard that when I worked with the labor movement. You can't put the ding back in the bell. One of my great union mentors used to say. So the culture is hypersexualized, regrettably. So one of the problems is that celibacy, I think, to many parishioners, is slightly unbelievable, first of all. And then there are so many people, going back to the very beginning of this conversation, who violate their vows.
You know what? I wouldn't say many. I really wouldn't.
Really? You wouldn't?
No.
Really?
there are too many people, let's put it that way, who break their vows. But, when I'm looking around at my brother Jesuits and brother priests, I simply do not see. Now I'm talking proportion, in terms of percentages. I.e., there are many people who broke their vows and who have relationships and who abuse children and things like that. But proportionately, I just don't think that's the case. In my experience, and I'm being completely honest, it happens from time to time, and you meet friends who break their vows, but for the most part, priests are keeping their vows of celibacy, and sisters and brothers are being chaste. So, and I'm speaking completely honestly. It's a rare thing when someone comes to you and says, I've fallen in love, or I'm in an affair with somebody. And it's a big deal. It's not as if it's sort of just sort of par for the course. So I hear what you're saying, and I trust you that you know people like that, and I believe you. But I'm saying, in my experience, proportionally, that just isn't the case. And I think that most parishioners know that their priests are keeping their vows. And just from a practical standpoint, frankly, the average age of most priests today is around 65, 70. And these guys are sort of settled in their life. That's not to say that a 65 or 70-year-old man can't have an affair, but the priests that I know are celibate, frankly. So I do question, commentators who say that there's this widespread, breaking of vows and people acting out. So
I hope you're right, because I think going back to the matter of the sexual abuse scandal, I think this is. My own feeling is this is the tip of the tip of the tip of the iceberg, and here's why. I think the vast majority of people who've been treated inappropriately by a priest are so deeply ashamed that they're not going to join any survivor network or speak
Right.
out or give an interview to the news. And each time there's a new disclosure, I mean, look at those 2 government reports in Ireland. I mean,
Right.
they are unbelievable. The extent of it is unbelievable.
It is, but I mean, and this is not to excuse it, and this is not a reason, but it is, at least in the United States, if we stick to the United States, it is, according to everything that I've read, it's no more widespread in the priesthood than it is in any other organization that deals with children. And so I think that, the conflation is that because there are so many cases in the Catholic Church, it must have something to do with celibacy, for example. I think doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I mean, there was a study from, I think it's the National Center for, I think it's Abused and Exploited Children, and I forget the fellow's name. His first name is Ernie. He's the director, who said that he does not see the Catholic Church, as particularly worse than any other institution. And that's not to say that the Catholic Church shouldn't be held to a higher standard, because I think it should. But I don't think you can say that the sort of percentage of people who abuse children is any higher than in the general population. In fact, he said it was 1 in 10 men abuse children, which I was shocked at. And the figure in the Catholic Church is something like 4% between 1950 and 2000. I mean, I think one of the reasons that these numbers are so shocking, and this is not, listen, I want to be clear, one case of child abuse is too many. I think everybody agrees with that. But what you're seeing cases from, over the course of 50 years. And that's why a lot of these figures are just so appalling. But so I think, once again, it's important to sort of tease out the cause and effect. And I don't think it's celibacy that's causing it. I think it's basically what's happening is, you have these psychologically sick men who are protected by this clerical culture, this sort of all-male, hermetically sealed clerical culture. That, to me, is the bigger problem. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It's less the celibacy. I mean, that's what's so difficult to sort of convey, which is this. The all-male clerical culture that gave rise to the secrecy and that hid these men, the proportion of which is no larger than in any other organization, is also a celibate culture. And so I think that all those different reasons and threads need to be pulled out of it so that we don't, and I know you're not doing this, so that we don't conflate all of those things, mistakenly. I'm much more a critic of the power and the secrecy and the lack of transparency than I am about anything about celibacy, because you look at the statistics. Even if we say if 4% or 5% is the high estimate, if 4 to 5%, and this was an independent lay board that did this after 2002. 4 to 5% of priests were abusers. That means that 96 to 95% are living healthy lives and are not abusing. And I think that also gets lost as well. So, I think we also have to keep that number in perspective as well. That doesn't excuse anything, but I think what's happening, unfortunately, is people are sort of drawing this conclusion that somehow there's something so wrong about celibacy and so wrong about chastity that it's leading to pedophilia and ephebophilia, which I just think is incorrect.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, but as long as it's hermetically sealed,
right?
Isn't it the case that people who maybe I want to be very careful about this.
No, who are trying to hide their sexuality.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
People who are struggling with this and so forth might might continue to find somewhat appealing, right?
Yeah, they might. I mean, they might. I mean, listen, the one thing is, though, that the screening and the training that happened 50 years ago is light years away.
I want to ask about
today.
that. I want to ask about that.
For example, let me spin that out a little bit. So in the past, let's say 40 or 50 years ago, and I'll talk about the United States Church because that's the one that I have the most experience in. A person might have entered the seminary at age 16, a minor seminary, right?
That's right.
So entered right out of high school, maybe with a letter from his local pastor and a few interviews. You're in. If you don't mind, I could spin out sort of how these things happen.
I don't think in great detail, but
No.
What we really want is the before and the after. So are you
Yeah,
saying
sure,
that now
sure.
people
Well,
they're psychologically screened now?
yeah, well, right, right. And before, let me just say, before, they would have gone from an environment, their home basically, where
Yeah.
they might not have had even, an experience of sex, say, during high school or something like that, a very sort of closed environment, to the seminary or the novitiate, or a religious order would form its men, into this all-male environment and really never have much sort of exposure to just sort of training or experience with or understanding or reflection on human sexuality, which of course at the time was seen in a very dim light, right, by the church. These days, first of all, men are entering the priesthood a lot later. I entered when I was 28. And just from my experience, let me tell you what I had to go through. I had to go through a series of psychological tests, for a day or two, right? Including extensive interviews with psychologists, and these aren't church psychologists. These are sort of independent psychologists. 8 or 9 interviews, recommendations from not only sort of Catholics but coworkers who weren't Catholic at all, and then 2 years of training in the novitiate where they would weed you out. It's very, very difficult. And then on top of that, after the sex abuse crisis, they are, this is where I will use the word, they are ruthless about sort of checking, which is good, checking for people like that. So would a guy, who wanted to sort of hide his sexuality, or worse, hide, say, pedophilia or an attraction to children, would he be drawn into the church? He might be, but these days he'd be weeded out, pretty severely and pretty quickly. Thank God, But in the past, you're right. What happened was, you had these guys who, I don't understand pedophilia. I'm not a psychiatrist. Who were in the priesthood and in religious life, who were not weeded out. And there are a million reasons for that. A lot of it had to do with, control and power and an inability to look at these things, seriously. So I agree with you. I think the church needs to be much more open and transparent, and that's starting. It certainly has started in the United States, in terms of the Dallas Charter and the zero tolerance policy. So that the church, I think you're right. In the past, yes, that definitely would have happened. But I would also say no more so than in any other organization. I mean, like the Scouts were teachers, right?
Oh, right.
I mean,
absolutely.
But the difference
right.
is, I mean, to sort of, I'll ask this question of myself because I'll anticipate your question. The difference is that those organizations were not quite as monolithic, right?
Right. Right.
And the other thing is, I read recently that said that the church keeps these scrupulous records, and so when the police want records, we can give them records that go back 50 years, whereas a school district might not be able to do that, and is not quite as centralized and organized. So, that explains this sort of volume of cases. Now, once again, that does not excuse one case of sexual abuse, and the church should be on its knees begging forgiveness, right? But I also think at the same time we have to, sort of carefully look at the reasons so we don't get distracted, frankly. Because I think if we direct all of our attention to celibacy, we're going to miss the real target, which I think is the culture, the clerical culture.
Yes, power and secrecy have their own corrosive effects over time.
Yeah, and also
the worry is for me. The worry is always all right. So there are different levels of person's capacity to live a celibate life. Everyone's capacity to live a chaste life should be clear and should be taught. From the point of view of young people in the church, I go back to this modeling question. Learning to live healthy lives and stuff. It seems to me clear that that any minister, Roman Catholic or otherwise, who teaches and preaches and who helps people through their most important, frankly, formation, their most important spiritual and ethical formation, needs to be able to say, this stuff is very difficult. Sure. I struggle with it, right? Mm-hmm. I struggle with it.
Right.
And we're inviting everybody to step up. We're inviting everybody to step up to a higher standard.
Well, I think that's true, and I think that most priests and I mean any sort of emotionally mature, psychologically healthy, and aware priest is going to talk about the struggles in everybody's life. Not just in celibacy, but in married life, right? With a single person who might be lonely, with a person who might be living with someone who's ill, with a person who might be living with someone who has Alzheimer's. Each of these states of life have their own challenges, and I think the good priest and minister, to use a broader term, recognizes that, and also speaks out of his or her own poverty and brokenness of spirit. I think that this Henry Nouwen, the Dutch spiritual writer, talked about the wounded healer, the person who's able to minister out of his own brokenness, which I think is frankly the most appealing kind of ministry that's done. But I'd also say, I take that one step further. I think that all Christians are in a sense called to be, models to one another, and are called to be ministers to one another. And so I would say, to broaden it, I think it's what theologians call the priesthood of all believers. It's not just the priest celebrating Mass or the sister in the Sudan or the brother who's teaching, but the mother and the father, and the doctor and the lawyer, who are living committed Christian lives. I'm sorry if I sound like I'm preaching.
I'm big on the priesthood of all believers.
Yeah, no, that's what the Second Vatican Council called, and I've written a lot about, which I think is quite beautiful, is the universal call to holiness.
That's right.
The idea that all of us can be saints in our own way. And I think in that world, I guess this is what I'm saying, and we're looping back, in that world of holiness are people who are called to the chaste lifestyle, like Francis, like Catherine of Siena, like Mother Teresa, like John the 23rd, like Oscar Romero, one of my great heroes, who lived a chaste life, worked with the poor, and, was martyred for his witness. And there's a man who is the real loving model. As well, I would say, the other loving model is the young mother who's taking care of her kids. Those are equally holy, I think.
I'm with you. We're coming to the end of our time, and I want to ask you to consult your crystal ball a little bit.
That hasn't worked in the past, but I'll try.
It hasn't worked for me either, but think about, you said earlier that you doubted we'd see the ordination of women to Eucharistic priesthood in our lifetimes. When do you think we might see that?
You know what? I have no idea.
Within the Latin Rite.
Yeah, I have no idea. The Church is very strong, the Vatican is very strong on the argument from tradition. The New Yorker piece that I mentioned that talks about the Anglican Church, that's also the argument of the conservative Anglicans. Right. I don't know, frankly. I don't know. A lot of the development in the Church and change in the Church is really up to the Holy Spirit, and I know that sounds overly pious, but people wouldn't have predicted the Second Vatican Council in the early 1960s, if you think about it. And so I think the Holy Spirit, blows where it will, basically. And that's not a evasive answer. I really don't know. I don't know what the Spirit has in mind for the Church, and that's probably a good thing for the Church, and certainly a good thing for me.
I think that's an appropriate place to say thank you, Jim, for this.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks for your great questions and an open and spirited discussion. That's a point of phrase.
We could bound forward for at least another hour, but I don't think our friends at BHT TV would welcome that. So for now, I'm going to say goodbye, and I hope to do this again.
Thank you very much.
All right, good.